The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today for the webinar. So we'd like to first of all welcome you to the Positive Choices webinar series, and the focus of our webinar today is on the maturing adolescent brain and the implications for prevention of drug and alcohol problems. But before we get to that, my name's Lexine Stupinski and I'll be chairing the session today. And just to mention briefly, first of all, some of the other webinars that we do have available as part of the Positive Choices webinar series. So we have several webinars currently available on demand, which means you can view the notes and also view the video of the webinar. So we have, first of all, a webinar about lesson planning with Positive Choices and really focusing on how to engage students with evidence-based drug education. We also have a webinar presented by Dr. Cass Chapman, which is looking at co-occurring mental health and substance use problems and how they affect young people. And then finally, we have a webinar about how parents and schools can protect against drug-related harms. So if you are interested in catching up on any of those previous webinars, I'd encourage you to visit positivechoices.org.au resources/webinars, where you can access all of those material. Okay, so just to tell you briefly for those who are joining us for the first time about what is Positive Choices. So Positive Choices is a central access point for evidence-based drug education, information and resources. And it was developed by researchers at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre and the National Drug Research Institute. It was developed in collaboration with teachers, parents and students who provided feedback along the way, and it was funded by the Australian Department of Health. And what Positive Choices aims to do is to provide easy to locate, trustworthy, up-to-date information and prevention resources, also guidance for teachers and parents about what they can do to prevent harms and how to approach these conversations with young people. It's an access point for a big variety of learning resources and materials, so such as fact sheets about various drugs, videos and games to engage young people with education, and importantly also access to classroom-based prevention programs that have been tested in schools and proven to reduce drug-related harms. So as I mentioned, Positive Choices was developed in consultation with young people, teachers and parents, and this webinar is one of the ways that we can continue these lines of communication with teachers, parents and students. And just to mention, if you would like to suggest a topic that you'd like to see a webinar presented on, please do email through to us at info@positivechoices.org.au and tell us your suggestion. Now, if you have used Positive Choices before, or even if you haven't, we really need your feedback to let us know what are the kinds of resources that you want to see on Positive Choices and what would be helpful to you in the classroom or as someone who works with young people. So if you are able to, we'd love if you could complete our teacher survey to tell us about what it's like for you implementing drug education in classrooms and what would help make that even better. And if you do complete the survey, you can go into the draw to win an iPad. So that's a little carrot, hopefully, to complete the survey if you're interested. All right, so without any further preliminary info, I'm very delighted to introduce Dr. Louise Mutant, who's going to be delivering our webinar for today on the topic of the maturing adolescent brain. And Dr. Louise Mutant is an Australian Rotary Health postdoctoral fellow at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, where her research focuses on applying innovative methods, techniques and technologies to further our understanding of epidemiology, classification and prevention of substance misuse and mental illness, and she's particularly interested in that critical adolescent period. And a really exciting project that Louise is working on at the moment, she's leading the Brain Games study, which is all about determining whether online training, so online brain games, can reduce risky behaviours, anxiety and negative emotions in adolescents. So I'm sure she'll be telling us some about that today. But so thank you so much for sharing some of your knowledge with us, Louise.
Wonderful, great. Thank you, Lexine, and thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us today. I'm actually going to start with a poll of the audience members today. So we have a question here for you, which Lexine is going to put up.
Yep, that's up there, Louise. So the poll question is?
Basically, I want to know approximately how developed is the teenage brain? So how close is it to an adult brain? Is it 20%, 40%, 60%, 80% or 100% developed? So we'll just wait for your responses to come in.
Okay, and most people have completed the poll now, Louise. So what we found was that the most popular responses were 60%, so that most people said 60% developed, and quite a few people also said 40% developed. And now I'm really curious to hear what the answer is.
Okay, well, you guys are pretty close. Actually, what we know is that on average the teenage brain is about 80% on its way to being a fully formed adult brain. So from about the age of 12 years right through to the age of 25, we're seeing quite large changes in the adolescent brain. And these findings are relatively new, which is why I asked you guys about it. It was actually once thought, and not that long ago, that after critical periods of growth in childhood, that brain development was actually quite static through adolescence and adulthood. But thanks to new imaging techniques like magnetic resonance imaging or MRI, we now know that the period of adolescence is a huge time for growth and change in the brain. So that's what I'm going to talk a bit about first, is the major changes that are occurring in the adolescent brain. So we know that the adolescent brain is under construction, it's under heavy construction. So there are actually two critical periods of brain changes, one at around the age of 3 and then another during adolescence. And this one during adolescence is actually quite a prolonged period of brain changes. It goes from the age of about 12 through to the age of about 25, and at about the age of 25 the brain looks pretty much like an adult brain. So the first thing that we see happening during adolescence is the pruning of cells, and that's actually sort of like the loss of brain cells. So during childhood and just before puberty, we actually see a big production in brain cells and connections between these brain cells. And then during adolescence, from about the age of 12 up until the age of 25, you get a gradual pruning of these cells. So there's losses of grey matter during which the brain is actually becoming more efficient. So what the brain is doing is it's retaining those cells and the connections between the cells that are important and useful, and getting rid of all the other noise, getting rid of those cells and connections that aren't very useful. So you can see images of brain cells on the panel on the left there, and you can see that at birth there's not much going on. Then at age 7 you've got this sort of forest of cells, and then during adolescence here we've got at age 15, what you see is a gradual pruning of these cells. So between the ages of 13 and 18, the teenager is actually losing about 1% of their grey brain matter per year. You can also see this happening in the coloured pictures down the bottom of the slide there. So orange and yellow areas are areas of high cell density, whereas the blue and the purple areas are areas of low cell density. So from adolescence through to your mid-20s, there's actually a lower density of brain cells because of this pruning process. So we've got pruning, or a loss of cells in the adolescent brain. Another thing that's happening is something called myelination. And what that is, myelin is like a fatty layer that's deposited around brain cells and around the connections between brain cells. So this fatty sheath, this myelin, makes brain cells and their connections stronger and faster. So you've got these two processes happening en masse during adolescence. You've got the pruning of cells and you've also got the myelination of cells. And these processes are working towards creating a more efficient brain that's fully developed at about the age of 25. So what we're going to look at here are just some of the areas in the adolescent brain that are under the sort of heaviest construction. So generally the brain develops from the back to the front. So it's the frontal areas of the brain that are the last to develop. And this is the area of the brain that's responsible for rational thought, for planning and decision making. So here we've got your frontal cortex, your lobes, the bit in pink there. And that frontal cortex is often referred to as the CEO of the brain because it's the part of the brain that's responsible for planning, strategy and judgment. And these are things that we collectively term executive functions. So recent research shows that it's really this area of the brain that undergoes a huge amount of growth just before puberty, and then it's this area of the brain where we're seeing that pruning of cells during adolescence. So it's really that area of the brain where we're seeing the biggest loss of cells during adolescence. What we also see are changes in the cerebellum. So this part of the brain has been thought to be involved in the coordination of muscles and physical movement. So it's also thought to be involved in the coordination of your thinking processes as well. So it's this area, responsible for the orchestration of thinking processes that is also undergoing quite dynamic change during the teenage years. And what we have here is the corpus callosum. This is a cable of nerves that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. It's believed to be involved in things like creativity and problem solving, and it appears to change and grow significantly throughout adolescence. And finally, I wanted to talk about the amygdala. So this area of the brain is associated with emotional and automatic gut responses. New imaging studies suggest that teenagers, when asked to interpret emotional information, they use this more reactive part of the brain rather than their thinking frontal region. So this may be why teenagers have some trouble occasionally regulating their emotions. So this is particularly important for adolescent behaviour is the fact, and drug and alcohol use, is the fact that there's an imbalance between the development of the amygdala and the frontal cortex. The frontal cortex doesn't develop as quickly as the amygdala, which means that adolescents are often using their amygdala in situations where adults would use their frontal cortex. So they're using this area responsible for gut reactions rather than their prefrontal cortex, which is involved in strategy, planning and sound judgment. So this imbalance between the amygdala and the frontal cortex is part of the reason that we see characteristic adolescent behaviours. So things like risk-taking, impulsivity, deficits in planned thinking, and it's also why we see the onset of drug and alcohol use during adolescence. In fact, some people have argued that because of these particular brain changes, adolescence is a critical period for the development of addictive behaviours. But we'll go into that a little bit more later. What I first wanted to touch on was adolescent drug and alcohol use. So I wanted to look at the rates of adolescent drug and alcohol use amongst Australian teens. So here we have the statistics for drinking amongst Australian adolescents. So 1 in 5 Australian adolescents, or those aged 16 to 17, drink alcohol at least weekly. Nearly 25%, nearly a quarter, have binged in the past week, and 1 in 5 adolescents don't drink at all. So the onset of alcohol use happens during adolescence. We also know that the onset of problematic use has its onset in adolescence. So what we see there is that the peak onset for alcohol abuse and alcohol dependence occurs during the teenage years. So we're seeing the onset of adolescent drinking, and we're also seeing the onset of problematic adolescent drinking. Here are the rates for adolescent cannabis use amongst Australian teens. So 3.4% of 12-year-olds have ever used cannabis, but then that rises exponentially over the teenage years. So by the age of 17, nearly a third of teenagers have ever used cannabis. 1 in 10 have used cannabis in the past month, and 6.6% have used cannabis in the past week. And here we have the rates of other drug use amongst 12 to 17-year-olds. So nearly 3% have used amphetamines or ecstasy, and 1.7% have used cocaine, and 1.6% of 12 to 17-year-olds have used heroin. So drug and alcohol use is definitely occurring in adolescence, and adolescence continues to be the peak period for the onset of alcohol and drug use. On a population level, though, you're seeing relatively low levels of drug use apart from cannabis. So a lot of the information that we have about the effects of substances on the adolescent brain is really limited to alcohol and cannabis. And even then, this is a relatively new field, and we really don't know much, but the research base is definitely growing. And that's what I wanted to touch on here. I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of that research, of the effects of adolescent drug and alcohol use on the adolescent brain. So many studies have looked at adolescents who use alcohol and drugs and compared them with those who don't. And they've looked at them in terms of these basic cognitive skills. And what we've seen is that amongst those who do use alcohol and drugs, there are deficits in terms of these cognitive skills. But what I want to stress here is that most of these studies have looked at heavy alcohol and substance users. So adolescents who use large amounts or who use to such an extent that it's causing problems in their lives. We currently know really very little about the effect of small amounts of alcohol and drugs in the brain. We don't know, for example, the effect of more common patterns of adolescent drug use. So things such as experimentation or binge drinking. We really don't know much about the effect of those patterns of use on the adolescent brain. So what we're focusing on here really are heavy and or dependent users. So what we're seeing is quite a diffuse effect on the adolescent brain. These tasks range from higher order functions, such as the ability to plan and make decisions, and they go down to more basic functions like inhibition and visual scanning. So from these lab-based studies, we can see that adolescents who use drugs and alcohol heavily behave differently. They have deficits in the performance of these cognitive tasks. Whilst these findings are consistent with the adult literature, so adults who use drugs and alcohol also show deficits in the performance of these cognitive tasks, there is some evidence that these deficits may be more likely to persist with abstinence amongst adolescents, so after the adolescent stops using. So for example, after 3 to 4 weeks of after an adolescent stops using cannabis, adolescents still show deficits in terms of a lot of these cognitive skills. So while this may seem like a scary prospect, other studies have provided evidence that while these deficits do persist longer than they do in adults, cognitive impairments do fully recover following sort of more prolonged periods of abstinence. So thanks to modern neuroimaging techniques, so things like MRI, we're now getting an insight into how these deficits in performance correlate to actual changes in brain structures. So here we're going to concentrate on just a few of the main areas of the brain that are affected across different drugs, including alcohol, cannabis and stimulants. So we've seen already that the frontal lobe is an important area undergoing transition during adolescence. And this is an area that's implicated in executive functioning, so our ability to plan, judge and strategize. So quite important higher order adult human abilities. And it's also here where we see the effects of different substances. So when looking at adolescent heavy drinkers and heavy cannabis users, we see differences in prefrontal cortex volume. So it's actually smaller amongst those who are heavy users of alcohol and cannabis. And this is actually particularly amongst females. This area does tend to develop earlier amongst females when compared with males, so that may be why we're seeing some differences in terms of sex. For adolescent methamphetamine users, there's also been shown to be differences in this prefrontal area when compared with non-methamphetamine using adolescents, but also when compared with adults who do use methamphetamine. So findings like this really underscore the particular vulnerability of the adolescent brain to damage from alcohol and drug use. And here we have the hippocampus. So this is a structure of the brain that's particularly important for memory. So a blackout from drinking alcohol. This is actually something that's quite commonly reported by adolescents, and it's much less commonly reported by adults. But a blackout probably reflects the effect of acute alcohol intoxication on the hippocampus. So in terms of structural brain differences, heavy alcohol and cannabis users show smaller hippocampal volumes when compared with their non-using counterparts. And we also see changes in white matter volume and integrity for alcohol, cannabis and methamphetamine. So here we have a cross-section of the human brain. So the grey matter pointed out there, the pink bits, that's where your cell bodies are. And your white matter, which is those lighter pink bits, that connects those grey areas together. So the white matter actually appears white because it's got a really high concentration of myelin in it. And as we saw earlier, myelination is occurring en masse during adolescence. So evidence shows that heavy alcohol and cannabis use have an effect on white matter volume as well as the integrity or the quality of white matter in the adolescent brain. And often this has been interpreted as an interruption of those important myelination processes that are occurring in adolescence. So what we're seeing here is a bit of a vicious cycle. The teenage brain is still under construction, causing changes which predispose adolescents to alcohol and drug use. Alcohol and drug use then has an impact on these developmental processes occurring in the brain, and this goes on to then create an even greater vulnerability for continued alcohol and drug use. This is why adolescence is often thought of as a particularly critical period for the development of addictive behaviours. But what I want to stress here are some of the limitations of this previous work. So as I've been stressing, most of these studies are looking at really heavy users, and most adolescents don't use heavily. They either binge or they use very occasionally in what we call experimentation sort of patterns. And we don't know what sort of effects these more common patterns of use have on the adolescent brain. Another limitation is that most of these studies are cross-sectional. And so what we don't know is whether drug use is causing these abnormalities that we're seeing, or whether these abnormalities exist already and they predispose adolescents to alcohol and drug use. We also don't know whether other factors, so things like socioeconomic status, cause both drug use and brain abnormalities. And really the evidence base is still small. A lot of the research techniques associated with this, so things like MRIs and other neuroimaging techniques, really have only been developed in the past couple of decades. So the evidence base with regards to the effects of drug and alcohol on the adolescent brain is really still very small. So these are just a couple of current studies that may help to shed some light on these limitations. So one of them is the adolescent binge drinking study, and it's a study that I've been involved in. It's led by Professor Marie Thiessen here at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, along with Professor Caroline Ray at Neuroscience Research Australia. And so they're coming from the perspective that adolescents tend to binge drink. They're not heavy users, and what they want to have a look at is what effect this has on the adolescent brain, what effect binge drinking has on the adolescent brain. So what they're aiming to do is recruit 160 adolescents from Sydney, and recruitment for this study is ongoing. We have had early looks at some of the data that we've got, and these early, and I want to stress preliminary results, do show structural changes related to binge drinking. So we are seeing differences in the brain when looking at more common drinking patterns in adolescents. Excuse me. And I also just wanted to briefly mention the Adolescent Brain and Development Study, which was announced in September 2015. So this is a prospective longitudinal study which will follow 10,000 kids aged 9 to 10 over a decade, and it's from different sites across the United States. So the idea of this study is to look at what these kids' brains look like before they start using substances, so at the age of 9 and 10, and then follow them up over time and see what happens in their brains. So this study will be important because it will look at the effect of, number one, low amounts of drug and alcohol use on the developing brain. And because of the way that the study is designed, it will also be able to look at the effects of alcohol and drug use on the brain as compared to the effect of brain vulnerabilities on alcohol and drug use. So we'll get at that sort of chicken and egg question that I was talking about earlier. So in this final section, I just wanted to give a quick introduction about treatment and prevention strategies. So I have felt a little bit like everything I've been talking about so far has been a bit of doom and gloom. Now I want to talk about some more positive stuff. How can we use our expanding knowledge of the brain to discover novel prevention and intervention strategies? So the first treatment strategy I wanted to talk about was inhibitory control training. So this has been used for various different maladaptive behaviours, but when used in the context of alcohol, it often involves intensive training on what is called the beer go, no-go task. So I'm going to pretend that you're a participant, and the participants are instructed to only press the spacebar when they see the letter F, and they're told not to press the spacebar when they see the letter P. So during the training you have one condition, and that's called the beer no-go condition, where the P is always partnered with an image of a image of a beer, and the F is always partnered with an image of water or some other non-alcoholic drink. So what you have to do during the training is to stop or inhibit that button pressing response when you see the letter P, which is associated with beer. So here I'm going to give you a bit of a demonstration of what that training actually involves. Hopefully there's not too much of a lag, so you get a good idea about what we do. So here we see the letter P, and the participant should not press the spacebar. Letter F, press the spacebar. Letter F, press the spacebar. P, don't press the spacebar. P, don't press the spacebar. F, press the spacebar. So that's just a quick introduction to what the inhibitory control training involves. And what they've actually found is that after training intensively on this task in just a single session, that those in the beer no-go group actually consume less beer immediately after training in a taste test. So those who have to stop themselves from pressing the space bar in response to the letter P or the pictures of beer actually drink less beer afterwards. So similar things have also been demonstrated with food, but just replacing the beer stimuli with food stimuli. So whether this sort of training can actually have any sort of prolonged effect is something that needs further study, but it's an exciting new area of research, and these findings are certainly exciting. And finally, I just wanted to talk quickly about the study which I'm currently running. So it's called the Brain Games Study. So this study is actually about preventing mental illness more generally, not alcohol and drug use specifically. But those changes in the adolescent brain that I talked about earlier may also be responsible for the development of a whole range of different mental illnesses during adolescence. So by the age of 25, 75% of people who are going to develop a mental illness have already developed it. And it may be that, particularly in terms of the prefrontal cortex, that area of the brain, it may be that the delayed maturation of that area is one of the reasons why we're seeing adolescence as the peak onset for a range of different mental illnesses. So we know that people with mental illnesses do have deficits in terms of executive functioning, and they've also shown that circuits in the frontal lobe, that area of the brain that's associated with executive functioning, there's also dysfunction in terms of circuits in the frontal lobe. So what I want to see in this study is whether we can effectively rewire the adolescent brain and stop mental illnesses from ever occurring. And I'm doing this through the use of online brain games, and these brain games are targeting executive functioning. So at the moment I'm recruiting 220 adolescents, or young adults as well, aged 16 to 24, and they've been identified as at risk for developing a mental illness. We have two conditions. One group gets the intervention, and these are brain games based on executive functioning tasks. We ask them to do it for about half an hour to an hour a day, 5 days per week, over 5 weeks. Then we have the control group, and these guys get brain games which are based on tasks which, as much as possible, don't focus on executive functioning. And again, we're asking them to train for about half an hour to an hour a day, 5 days per week, over 5 weeks. And what we're looking at is whether that intervention group shows improvements over the control group in terms of things like cognition, personality, day-to-day functioning. We're also looking at alcohol use, as well as symptoms of mental illness. So we're using an online brain games provider called Lumosity to look at this. So these games are designed to be fun and engaging for the participants. But what I'm really hoping is that adolescents can have fun whilst doing something proactive to prevent the occurrence of mental illnesses. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I guess I hand it over to you now, Lexine, and the audience for any questions or comments.
Yes, thank you. So I did forget to say at the start, but we would encourage anyone who has questions from any part of the session to put them into your control panel. So there's a little questions box, so you can send those through to us. So we'd love to have those questions from you. And so just to now, oh, I've got someone who's just come through and said we can see you but not hear you, but that was right from the start. So hopefully that was from before we started and everyone can actually hear us, I think, Louise.
I hope so.
I hope so. No, I'm pretty sure. I can certainly hear you anyway. Okay. So just one question from the thing that you talked about in terms of brain development that was really interesting. So you said that that alcohol use during the teenage years might be affecting the way, I think, the grey or the white matter volume. Is that right?
Yep, yep.
And you
It
mentioned
affects both, but I really talked about white matter. But yep.
right, and you mentioned that that might then set them up on a kind of path of vicious cycle. So are you saying it might mean that they then continue to make maybe choices that involving alcohol, or not be quite so good at controlling or inhibiting their behaviour henceforth?
Yeah, exactly. So you've got these changes going on, these big changes going on in the brain. These, because of these specific changes, you're seeing an increase in the likelihood of alcohol and drug use, risk-taking behaviours more generally. And then alcohol and drug use actually has an effect on these specific changes that are occurring during the brain. So like I was talking earlier, the myelination process and the pruning of cells, which then creates this vicious cycle, yeah, where you are then more likely to continue using drug and alcohol.
Okay. Yes. All right. Thank you. Someone's written in and confirmed that they could hear us, so we're okay
Beautiful.
on
Thank
that
you.
front, Louise. A few
Excellent.
people have said, could they please be emailed a copy of the slides? And yes, so we have recorded the session and we will be sending you all out an email. It's probably first thing tomorrow morning with the slides and with also a link to the video in case you want to listen to Louise again. And so someone has also asked about whether this was the source of the prevalence statistics that you put up, Louise. So you might not know that off the top of your
Yep.
head. So in terms of alcohol consumption?
I think it's definitely one of the factors. The reason why we see such a high prevalence of alcohol
Sorry,
and
no,
drug
it was
use.
more a question of whether that information was collected from an Australian
Oh,
sample or, yeah.
oh yeah. Sorry, it's Australian data. It was collected from various places. A lot of it from the National Survey of Mental Health and Wellbeing in 2007. That's with regards to the prevalence of alcohol. And then from the National Drug Strategy Household Surveys, the rest of the data came from.
Okay, excellent.
In terms of prevalence, yeah.
And someone's asked, can you tell me when the results of the study of adolescent brains and developing mental illness might be available and how to find more information about that?
Yes, well, we're currently recruiting. I've got about 80 adolescents and young adults going through or have gone through. I want 220, so we're still recruiting. And then we're actually, I didn't go into much detail, but we're following them up for, we ask them questions at post-training and then we follow them up for 12 months to see what sort of effect we have on sort of characteristics related to mental illness. So results are still a while off, but we are recruiting and I believe that Lexine is going to send out an information package after this webinar, and that the study website will be part of that, and that's where you can find out all the information you like about the study.
Excellent. Okay, so so the idea with that is that the brain, so correct me if I'm wrong, but is it that the brain's like a muscle and you can do exercises to train certain parts, and that might mean that adolescents are then protected against some of these problems that are related to brain issues? Is that right?
Exactly. So brain training exercises have been used with some success in people who are suffering from a mental illness, particularly in schizophrenia. You see there's been meta-analyses done which show that you see improvements in terms of functioning, so things like going back to work and things like that, but also that you see improvements in symptoms. So what I want to do, and it's actually been used in a lot of different mental illnesses, so with depression and things like that as well. So what I want to do is take a step back and look at whether we can use it as a prevention strategy, so to really train that area of the brain implicated in mental illnesses before mental illness sort of occurs or takes place. So it's very new research, but yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. All right. There's a question that's come through about strategies for parents in terms of influencing adolescents away from drug and alcohol consumption. So that's something that I can probably answer.
I
Say
think
if
you
you
might be better. Yep.
if you want to. Okay. So
No, Lexi, take it away.
well, I just to mention that actually that's it's a great question, and it's something that we are within Positive Choices trying to provide as many resources as possible for parents about, you know, how to start those conversations, when's the right time, how do you approach them, how do you even, you know, get the ball rolling in the first place. So there are some resources. So if you go on to positivechoices.org.au and go through the parents portal, you'll actually see some fact sheets on that topic. But in addition, we are planning a webinar for next year on exactly that topic, and also we're currently in the process of developing some new resources, so in terms of a training program for parents on exactly that topic. So I guess it's a matter of stay tuned. So Louise, would you add anything to that?
No,
Okay.
that sounds wonderful.
Excellent. All right, so someone's raised a question about the data from about drug and alcohol being from 2007 and whether we think that that's still relevant given that it's no longer 2007 anymore. So is it relevant to kind of current trends?
There is data from the National Drug Household Strategy Survey which is saying that the rates of use are reducing, but we're talking slight reductions, sort of 0.2% and things like 0.02% and things like that. So there are slight reductions in terms of alcohol, adolescent alcohol and substance use in the interim, but the changes aren't massive.
Yeah. Okay.
But the data in terms of sorry, the data that was the alcohol data. The data from on other drugs was all much more recent. 2013, the most recent drug household survey.
Excellent, thank you. We've got lots of people that know their data emailing questions through. And so another one which is more a kind of broader question. So I think you made the distinction that a lot of the research that has been done already was studying people that were heavy drinkers, and the new study led by Marie Thiessen was that the first study to look at binge drinking rather than heavy drinking. Is that right?
And at the same time, other studies are going on in the States that are looking at binge drinking as well.
Right.
Whether the results are there yet or not, I'm not sure.
Okay, because someone's asked for clarification on that. So, but what you're saying is that most of what we know about is data from heavy drinking. So most of those brain effects.
Yeah, but certainly there are other teams out there looking at binge drinking. I think I can pretty safely say that in terms of low use, there's not much out there at all.
Okay, but it's a really important question, isn't it? Because so exactly this question coming through, that it's going to be important for us to understand, are the brain effects there if someone's just binge drinking irregularly, like even once a month? Is that still harming their brain, or is it only kind of prolonged regular use that's having brain effects? And so I guess that's sort of what your study is trying to get at.
Yep, certainly.
And preliminary results are saying there are some structural effects even with just binge drinking. Yeah.
Yep. That's right.
Okay, interesting. All right. Now, just having a look through at the additional, you've got lots of questions coming through, Louise. Okay, someone's just asked if there are any parent resources available in languages other than English, and there actually is one site that has translated resources for parents. So if you do visit Positive Choices and just have a look, off the top of my head I can't quite remember the name of the site, but there is actually one that has fact sheets at least translated into different languages for parents. Okay, so another one, is there, okay, this one might not be one that you're able to answer, Louise, but is there any evidence that we should be informing students earlier? So for example, in year 5 or 6 about the dangers of drinking rather than waiting until later on?
Yeah, I think so. People like Marie Thiessen would be better placed to answer questions like that, but I know that we start our prevention programs for alcohol and drugs at the age of 13 because that's really, number one, it needs to be relevant to them. If talking to a 9 or 10-year-old about I mean, I think there are prevention strategies that you could implement at that age, not necessarily the ones that we're talking about here though. And I believe there are prevention programs out there for younger students. But yeah, that's my main area of expertise would be with the adolescents.
And I guess it's about balancing that need to wanting to prepare them for when they are going to be exposed and are going to need the information versus, like you said, telling them about it at a time when it's relevant to them. And perhaps in year 5 the information isn't as powerful yet because it's going to be years till they're placed in that situation. Okay, now this is an interesting question that is possibly good as a last question, so we'll have it as a bit of a summing up question. But in your opinion, what are the key messages that we should be giving students regarding the impacts of alcohol and drug use on the brain?
Certainly the alcohol and drug use does have effects on the adolescent brain. There's evidence to show that it has effects on how your brain works, but also on the structures in your brain, so the way that your brain works, but also those structures. I guess the other key messages would sorry, I sort of lost my train of thought there. Can you ask the question again, Lexine? Sorry.
Yep. So just
the main take-home point.
Students, yeah. What should teachers be telling students? What could parents be telling students to help them really think about, I guess, looking after their brains when it comes to drug and alcohol?
Yeah, just that the evidence shows that it does have an effect on the brain, the way that it works, and the structures within the brain.
Yeah, so the way that it develops, I guess, was in terms of structures is what you're talking about. It seems like it's affecting...
Yeah, and I guess that the fact that adolescence is really an important period when there is a lot of growth going on there. So you need to be particularly careful of your brain when you're in adolescence.
Yes, and just to say, I've got a line stuck in my head, which is from a video. There's a video from Turning Point called the Teenage Brain Under Construction, which is a great video that can be used to show adolescents. It's got animation, it's got all these cool stuff happening, and it shows what's happening in the brain in a really simple way, and how alcohol affects that. So how alcohol affects you more in the moment rather than long-term effects like Louise has been talking about. So that might be a good resource. And a line at the end of the movie that sticks with me, it's something like, look after your brain, it's the only one you've got, which I think is a really nice kind of simple message for young people about drugs and alcohol and the brain. All right, excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much for giving your time to us this afternoon, Louise. And as we've said, what we'll be doing is emailing you out. So there's obviously there's been some questions about sources for the information. So what we can do is just put some of those references onto the handout that we can then email out to you all, along with the video and also links to the brain game study and the other resources that we've mentioned during this conversation. And now if you just progress my slide, Louise.
Yep, sure.
What have I got up next? So yes, just to tell you again that we do have additional webinars that if you've enjoyed this one and you want to hear more about, particularly about those questions relating to drug prevention within schools and what parents and schools can do, which we've talked about quite a lot today, we have within our webinar series webinars that address those topics as well that you can watch the video of. And in addition, we'd love to hear from you. Next slide. we'd love to hear from you in our survey about positive choices. So letting us know what are the kinds of resources that you think are really needed, whether it's for parents, whether it's in the classroom, what do you want to see more of with positive choices. So we have a teacher survey at the moment that we're using to try to find that out. So it would be great if you would be willing to participate, give us some of your time to tell us about what you're wanting. All right, so apart from that, thank you, Louise. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we hope to see you next year. We've got a really exciting schedule planned for next year. As I said, some things about resources for parents, also some topics around legal highs, the new drugs that are coming on the market. So we'll have a whole new webinar schedule for next year that we will be letting you know about. And good afternoon.